derivatives should be regulated because it's multi-billion-dollar worth of stuff. And it's not being regulated, and Wall Street's trying to gut it out of Dodd-Frank, et cetera, et cetera. But we won't go there. There are reasons why derivatives, people, farmers, and companies use derivatives to offset risk, for example. Can also lead to big problems. But I was just interested in here, this collateralized mortgage application, whatever that means. What was interesting for me is you had to solve something like 10 integrals in 360 dimensions. So I said to Pascal, program this using Monte Carlo, but also use quasi-Monte Carlo. Now, it's quasi-Monte Carlo is we're actually doing deterministic sampling, and the way you choose the points is through something called low discrepancy sequences. I won't pursue that unless people want me to. The important thing is it's deterministic sampling. And the world experts in number theory, which is a topic in number theory connected with something called discrepancy, believe that quasi-Monte Carlo, meaning deterministic sampling, but not arbitrary deterministic according to low discrepancy sequences, could be used for integrals bigger than 12. And there was a reason, a theoretical reason for that. So Pascal goes off, I say, compare quasi-Monte Carlo and Monte Carlo on this real-world problem that I got from Goldman Sachs. And he came back to our research group and said, quasi-Monte Carlo always beats Monte Carlo by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. And we said, nonsense. Harold Niederreiter doesn't believe that, and he's forgotten more about this than you'll ever know. Niederreiter is one particular expert. You must be wrong. And I probably held up his PhD for about 6 or 12 months until he convinced us he was right and the world was wrong. So Pascal and I went down to the usual suspect, Morgan Stanley, and so on, and told them about these results, and they were very skeptical. Initially, Columbia actually got a patent and license. We're trying to get some money out of this. There is a belief that the banks, some banks are actually using quasi-Monte Carlo because it's inside the bank, and if you can tell me which banks are using quasi-Monte Carlo, we could have a conversation. I'd buy you coffee. That's where things stand. I say, it wasn't why did Pascal make a discovery that the world experts didn't? Because the world experts were using mathematical tests that they constructed, and by pure luck, we had a real-world problem. So here's the open question. Again, open, Pascal, this is 94, 6 plus 13 is 19. This is 19-year-old problem, which is characterized for which problems quasi-Monte Carlo beats Monte Carlo. Open. I mean, we have examples. In finance, there's also problems in physics, where it turns out quasi-Monte Carlo wins, but there's no theory. But there's been a little cottage industry trying to explain this effect. We worked like physicists, actually. We did experiments and reported the results of the experiments, but there's no theory. So in a sense, it's like an empirical result, which is unusual in computer science, where we don't, at least in my work, where we have empirical results and don't have explanatory theory. So that sort of deal with us. But remember, if you can find out which banks are using our stuff and not paying Columbia for the license, we can do business.
Guys have any other questions? Well, I'll go on. Yes, Paul.
Is Moore's law dependent on any economic factors, or is it purely theoretical?
Hell no, it's purely empirical. And in fact, there's another doubling law. So there's Moore's law, a doubling law, with a very short doubling period. Like Moore was fudging. Sometimes it was 18 months, sometimes it was 2 years, but a short doubling factor. And a small calculation shows you that it's an exponential trajectory. But there's another exponential law, which is that the fab facilities, the cost of a fab facility, that is a facility for fabricating stuff, the cost of those also doubles every couple of generations. So even Intel can barely afford to build a fab facility. Even countries can barely afford it. So there's a doubling law on the cost of fabrication facilities, because it's harder and harder to fabricate these things. So no, there are lots of what I call scaling laws all over computing. Cost of communication, cost of memory, which has gone down even faster than the density of transistors. I sometimes say my field is the theory of scaling laws.
Can we talk a little bit about complexity, which is, I know, an interest of yours? You know, it's sort of floating around all of these questions. So words that come to my mind, I mean, I don't know exactly how to put this. I mean, complexity is one of those things that becomes, it seems to be manageable in computing where it had never been before. So something could be really complex, and what could you do but throw your hands up? But the computer as a tool now allows us to think about complexity as something that's manageable, but also, I mean, you could ask questions, or you could study complexity, as I think you've done. Is that right? So are there open questions about complexity? I mean, are there things that are irreducibly complex, and we know that's going to be the case? Or, and how does, I guess my other question would be the sort of newer concept of emergence, that maybe you get to a certain level of complexity, but then a somewhat simpler solution emerges out of complexity. I mean, you know, complexity, you could say, well, the number of molecules in this room is extremely difficult to track because it's really just too complex to keep track of all the molecules in the room. But if all you care about is air pressure, you don't need to know all the molecules in the room. Air pressure emerges out of all those molecules moving around as does temperature.
Right. Well, Stuart asked about 6 questions.
Sorry.
I actually got even one out.
And before I answer some of them, there are certain words which are very sexy, meaning different disciplines, different people love to use them. One of them is complexity. Complexity is all over the place. And the second, another one is chaos. So those are 2 of them. And a fellow named Seth Lloyd, who's in the mechanical engineering department. He was a postdoc with Mary Delmon. He's a very famous, he's the guy who postulated quarks, Nobel laureate in physics. Postdoc with him, and then he became a professor of mechanical engineering at MIT. And he likes to call that department, that's the quantum mechanical engineering department. And the head of that department has just been appointed dean of Columbia School of Engineering and Applied Science. So Seth Lloyd, a very smart cookie, wrote, and I know through the connection with Delmon and also Santa Fe Institute, Lloyd wrote a paper that he sort of wants to disown, and I have several copies of it in my files, several versions, called 31 Flavors of Complexity. You know where the 31 refers to, where he writes, here are 31 different phrases with complexity in the title, and the conclusion, we had a 2-hour meeting at the Santa Fe Institute about this issue of complexity, and in fact we wrote this paper after that meeting. The conclusion was complexity by itself has no meaning without an adjective. So there is what I've been talking about, what I work on, primarily is computational complexity, which is minimal cost for solving problems. But there's Kolmogorov complexity, there's depth complexity, there is the Santa Fe Institute, sort of the mother church of what we call the sciences of complexity, whatever that is. So it's how do very complicated things get built out of very small things, for example. So many different ideas, many different types of complexity. I only work primarily, I'm sort of interested in the complexity issues. That's why I hang out at the Santa Fe Institute, but my main research area is just a very special computational complexity, which itself is a huge field. It's mostly theoretical computer science.
Is there a relationship that's worth exploring between, say, complexity and predictability? I mean, do things become more or less predictable? Is that sort of a way of measuring, well, that's not exactly a way of measuring complexity, but, I mean, of course, the purpose of science always is somewhere along the line to come up with something predictable, right? I mean, we want a law or a theory or
What's the difference between science and philosophy?
yeah, I guess.
It's one of the things asked me, what's the difference? Well, we like to prove things. And we change our mind when we're wrong.
Yes.
Whereas
Sometimes it takes a while to change our minds
some
when we're wrong,
institutions
but-
don't change.
Yes, that's true, that's true.
But where, I think of the predictability issue more having to do with chaos. So if a system is chaotic,
Mhm.
either the logistic equation